Well, now you've really opened up a very interesting part of the conversation. Could you please talk a little bit about more where those parts of the brain are? And I remember in one of our previous conversations, you so vividly talked about what actually happens in the brain. So if you could talk a little bit about where those parts of the brain are and what happens to them.
Well, and since this is a general audience, I don't want to get terribly technical, but to talk in general terms, we're learning more and more about the brain, and the more we learn, the more fascinating it is. I mean, it's an incredible organ, and it's helped us survive as a species, for millions of years. And one of the key things, I think, has been that our brain is set up to deal with danger using two different methods, or two different paths. One of the paths I call the fast path, or the fast track, and the other is the slow track. And the slow track is the one we usually think of when we experience danger. We see or we hear a threatening event, and it's processed in our brain, and it goes to the thinking part of our brain. And we can think about it. We can make a decision. Should we run? Should we stay? Should we curl up and play dead? But what most people are not aware of is that there's also a fast track. At the same time, our brains process through the emotional system the sound or the visual image, and before it even goes to the conscious mind, we're reacting. Messages go to our muscles, to our endocrine system, and we can react incredibly quickly. And in fact, it takes about half the time for the message to go along the fast track versus the slow track. But the key is that the fast track is unconscious. We're not aware of it happening, and we really can't control it in our conscious mind. It's an automatic process. And the other key thing is that it affects our memory through the hippocampus. And when we can remember about an emotion, or remember about our fear, that's really going through our conscious mind. But our actual emotional memory is unconscious. It kind of, when we experience a trauma, our brains become hardwired to react to that trauma if it occurs again. And it's one of the things that kept us alive thousands of years ago. Because if we were attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, our bodies almost, you could think of it as our bodies learned how to respond. So if we saw another saber-toothed tiger, before we'd even think about it, we'd be reacting. The difficulty is now, where we don't have saber-toothed tigers, and our environment is really much more regulated and much safer, we still have this old programming or hardware. And I guess we're programmed to have these emotional memories that will occur without us even knowing it, and are very, very difficult. You can't will them away. And that's what often happens to accident victims, or some of our veterans who come home, is certain things backfire, or a door slamming, or maybe just even walking in the woods, trigger these old memories, which have a very strong emotional basis, and that can exacerbate, and it's much more frequent in individuals with post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Well, this is fascinating, because you're talking now about so many layers of the mind and memory and experience. It sounds as if there's a lot about this that we still don't really understand, too. There's a lot of research yet to be done.
Absolutely. We really have come light years in the past 20 years in understanding the brain, but we're just understanding a small piece of it. I mean, it's fascinating. There's more neural connections in your brain than there are stars in the sky. That's how complex it is. However, our research, and then a lot of the clinical research, is beginning to show that PTSD is very treatable. There's a lot we can do, particularly if we catch the problems early, to help the individual's brain not go into this state of constant vigilance and really being prepared for battle or catastrophe. But people have to seek help, and that's been one of the most difficult things about, I think, the war experience and the experience of veterans, is because of the culture, because they're warriors, they're used to being brave and not asking for help. It's very difficult for them to say, hey, I've got this problem. And I think because it happens in the brain, there's much more of a stigma. It can be seen as weakness or cowardiceness, and it really is not. It's an injury, just like losing a limb or a head injury or anything else. But the stigma has kept veterans from being able to ask for help.
That's one of the things also, when I spoke with you and Carolyn Carino, who will also be presenting on June 17th, I was fascinated by this notion that she discovered through her interviews, that there's this code of silence, almost. People don't want to talk about it, and she's interviewed World War II, particularly Marines who fought in the Pacific Theater, and they've had a terrible time with it, but they're so ashamed of their experiences and how they responded to the war that they find it hard to talk about, seek help. Could you talk a little bit about Carolyn's research?
Surely. I'm lucky enough to have a colleague, Carolyn Carino, who is the daughter of a Marine who fought in the Pacific during World War II. And she wanted to get her to know her father better and try to understand him. And so she contacted, after he died, she contacted some of his fellow soldiers. And they really welcomed her and asked her to come to reunions, and over the last 5 or 6 years she's become very good friends with these men. And she's a very lively and empathetic person, and I think through her friendships with them, they began to be willing to talk to her about some of their experiences. And as they opened up, Carolyn began to realize that these men were still suffering from many of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress syndrome. They still had this very exaggerated startle response. They would have nightmares. They'd relive events that had occurred 50 years ago or more. They'd wake up in the middle of the night and think they were in the middle of World War II. And these weren't homeless people. These were not people who obviously had psychiatric disorders. In fact, first of all, when I grew up, these were the men who were seen by my generation as being our greatest heroes. And then they came home and rebuilt America. These men were kind of the captains of industry, very active in their communities. They gave a tremendous amount to their communities and to this country, and nobody knew that they were going home at night after working all day and having terrible nightmares, or waking up in the middle of the night and thinking they were in the South Pacific. And it's a shame that these men had suffered alone and many of them never got any help until recently. And the interesting thing is, at this point, these men who were in their 80s and 90s want desperately to help these younger soldiers, to make sure that they don't have to go through the loneliness they went through in re-experiencing these events.